Hi, I'm Charlene Lam. I'm a certified grief coach and the founder of the Grief Gallery. Today, I want to share with you 5 ways that my Asian heritage has influenced my experience of grief. I'm Chinese American. I was born in Europe and I grew up in New York City, in Chinatown, and in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I can only speak for myself and to my own experiences of grief and all the factors that go into that. My family history, the culture of my family of origin, and the larger culture that I grew up in. And I really want to emphasize that because Asian Americans, there are a lot of different kinds of Asian Americans. There are a lot of different kinds of Asians. We are not a monolith. Our cultures can be very different, and our individual experiences can be really different. So I just want to speak for myself and my own experience. Some context for the losses I've experienced. One, my grandmother, she died of cancer when I was 5. And that was my first experience with understanding what death was. And that wasn't an easy lesson for reasons I'll share in a moment. And then my mother died from a stroke when I was 35. And that was January 2013. And that was the biggest loss that I've experienced as an adult. Here are 5 ways that my Asian heritage shaped the kind of support that I got and influenced my experience of grief and loss. 1, assumptions that were made. There are a lot of assumptions made about how different cultures experience grief and approach grief and death and loss. I have had everyone from friends to strangers to therapists and other grief support people say, oh, well, Eastern cultures have such a healthier relationship with death. And there's so many more ways and practices of staying connected to their ancestors. Yes, that might be true. And as I said, we are not a monolith. We are lots of different kinds of cultures. Eastern culture includes East Asia, Southeast Asia, and there are a lot of different cultures and religions and practices. And just because maybe generations and generations ago in China, there might have been practices for staying connected to our ancestors, that doesn't mean that any of that carried over to my experience growing up as a Chinese American child or in my practices as an adult. So that's 1. Assumptions made about what my practices might be, what my family and what my culture's approach to grief, death, and dying might look like. 2, not talking about illness and death was actually the norm. So contrary to that belief that Eastern cultures are so much better about talking about death and talking about the dying and staying in touch with our ancestors and people who have passed on, that absolutely was not my experience. In fact, it was the opposite. Throughout my childhood and even my adulthood, a lot of information was withheld. When someone was ill, when someone was in trouble, when someone had died, I often would not find out for days, for weeks, for years. And there might have been a range of reasons for that. I was the youngest child, so sometimes that was to protect me. With my grandmother, my mother didn't have the language to explain what death meant, that she was actually gone. And often there were cultural aspects. I remember being so confused because my grandmother had gone into the hospital and she had died. And I remember holding my mother's hand in the lobby of our apartment building. And a neighbor asked, how is my grandmother doing? And my mother said, she's fine. And as a 5-year-old, I was so confused. What do you mean she's fine? You've just been saying that she's gone, she's dead. And looking back now, I have so much compassion for my mother, for why she said that. She tried to explain it to me later, kind of saying she didn't want the neighbors to gossip. She didn't want to have to field questions. And as my aunt explained it, often culturally, there might be aspects of not wanting to bother other people, not wanting to share bad news. And there's some really interesting cultural aspects of that. But talking and not talking about illness in particular and death was the norm in my family of origin. So you can imagine how that influenced my experience of grief and loss and the idea of getting support. That I was taught that talking about illness and death is unlucky. You shouldn't be talking about it. People don't want to talk about it. And I can only imagine how isolated, potentially, members of my family felt at different times because other people didn't even know that they had lost a person. So that's number 2. Not talking about illness and death was actually the norm. And related to that is number 3, the role of superstition when it came to grief and death and loss. One of the reasons that my family of origin, my Chinese American family, did not talk about death and dying was because it was considered unlucky. There were a lot of superstitions that my family members had inherited from their family members and from their culture. And while my parents weren't that traditional, they still held on to some of those superstitions. So, for instance, Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, that's an important time of year culturally. And you might know about some of the things that are considered lucky, right? Red envelopes, oranges, the color red. Those are all considered lucky. And there are a lot of things that are considered unlucky when it comes to the Chinese New Year. So that includes talking about death and dying. And unfortunately for me, my mother died shortly before Chinese New Year. And my family members said, don't tell people. It's unlucky. We don't want to make them feel uncomfortable heading into the Lunar New Year. And these were family members who had been in the US for decades and in a lot of ways were very modern, but they still held on to some of these aspects of superstition. When my uncle was sick a couple of years ago, he didn't want to go into the hospital because the Lunar New Year was coming up. And I've heard similar accounts from other Chinese friends and colleagues who said, yeah, I wasn't welcome into other people's homes because I had recently experienced a death in the family. Again, you can imagine how isolating that might feel in circumstances that already feel isolating. If we think that elements of community support are so important after we lose a loved one, how does that role of superstition, you can see how it might have come up and blocked some of that feeling of community support. So number 4, another way that being Asian influenced my experience of grief, this disconnect with traditions. And this varies a lot from family to family. Some families are really traditional, and they do practice using an altar. Maybe their family had Buddhist traditions and they maintain that. Maybe they went to the cemetery regularly and had rituals. I personally did not grow up with those traditions. I saw altars in restaurants and in businesses when I grew up in Chinatown. And I knew that, offering fruit and burning incense on those altars were a thing that was done, but I never understood the purpose. That was not something that we did in our home, and my parents and family members didn't really tell me much about it. So I think as Chinese American immigrants, my parents emphasized fitting in and assimilating with American culture. There's a long tradition of this. Asian Americans are often cited as the model minority, and that is a myth, the model minority myth. But I think the belief that fitting in was the way to success was not uncommon as a viewpoint for a lot of Chinese immigrant families. And that was certainly the case for my family. So rather than sending me to Saturday school so that I could learn Chinese along with some of my classmates in Chinatown, my parents didn't want me to do that. They really wanted me to have more of a childhood, an American style childhood where you had your weekends off. So while I appreciate that, there were definitely aspects of Chineseness and learning about my heritage and some of the traditions that they didn't teach me. So as an adult, I do feel a bit of that disconnect. There were also expectations about how to grieve in a Chinese way or an Asian way, and how to grieve in an American way. So that was part of the disconnect, that I think some family members expected grieving to look like being stoic and being strong. And then some of more Americanized family members really expected me to be more emotional and to cry more after my mother died. So that was another aspect of that feeling of disconnect, of what is right, and not really feeling like I knew what was right or expected of me. And that brings me to my last point about how being Asian influenced my experience of grief and loss, and still continues to. That it's a very multi-layered experience. And this is true of a lot of grievers, where we keep on peeling the layers of the onion. If you've heard that saying, that there are just these layers and layers that we keep on peeling and finding as we learn to integrate loss into our lives, as we learn to coexist with our grief, even as we move forward with our own lives. And for me, that layer, those layers look a lot like what shaped my family's responses to death, dying, and grief. When I was younger, I had a lot of resentment and a lot of judgment for what I described. I had a lot of judgment about family members withholding information or trying to protect me by making sure I was more American than Chinese. And over the years, especially in the more recent years, I've been peeling back layers of why did they do that? And I have so much more understanding and compassion for why. And often it came back to a matter of survival, that either for economic survival and sometimes for their actual survival, there were aspects of lying, telling half-truths. When I was little and growing up in the US and learning in elementary school how you shouldn't lie and how you should always tell the truth, it did not make any sense to me why my family members would withhold information and why they would lie about some of these hard truths. And as I got older and as I learned about things like the Cultural Revolution in China and discriminatory immigration laws in the US, I came to understand that, oh, a lot of my heritage involved necessary lying. It involved telling half-truths, masking, not telling the full story. Whether that was because US immigration laws said that Chinese men could not bring their families. Whether it was because, oh, I had relatives who lived through the Cultural Revolution in China, and that trauma they brought over with them when they immigrated to the US. And there's so many layers of that I'm still unpeeling. More recently, I was reading about the history of Chinatown and why Chinatowns formed. And I read that, Chinatowns would form as a form of protection because of attacks on the Chinese immigrants in the larger society. And it had never struck me that that was a reason why Chinatowns would form and why Chinatowns could be so insular and why they kept to themselves. And all of that, there are layers of grief, there are layers of loss, there are layers of me trying to understand better my relatives that I've never met. And I think often of the ones that I don't remember, right? I recently cleared out my storage unit, my family storage unit. And these are photos of my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather died when I was 3, and he got cancer. Did not tell anyone about the symptoms until it was too late, which is not uncommon for men of a certain age. But again, that was the story of my family's life, not telling things. And my grandmother, she died when I was 5, so I don't really remember her. And I think about what layers of loss and grief did they carry? Did they actually have any kind of opportunity to address their grief? And what were they taught? And I'm still peeling back the layers. So thanks for spending this time with me and hearing a little bit about my story. Again, it's only mine. I can only speak to my own experience as a Chinese American, as someone who grew up in New York and the San Francisco Bay Area, and who grew up in my particular family, in our particular circumstances. I hope that gives you at least one experience, one idea of the different ways that being Asian might influence someone's experience of grief and loss. Thanks for listening.